Hi guys, how old are you? I'd love to see the age range of our viewers. Write your age below.
You know those family gatherings where everyone pretends to be civilized, but underneath it all simmers a powder keg of old grudges and calculations over who gets the biggest slice of whatever pie is left on the table. And in my case, that powder keg was about to explode right there in the stuffy lawyer's office in small-town Milford, Ohio, where Emily Harper, a 48-year-old divorced journalist who'd spent the last 2 decades chasing stories in the bustling chaos of Chicago, found myself dragged back home by the unexpected death of my grandfather, the man who'd built our family's auto parts business from scraps after my grandmother's tragic car accident way back when the Rust Belt was still humming with promise. The drive from the city had been a grueling 5 hours over cracked highways lined with fading billboards advertising long-closed factories, my mind replaying every argument that had driven me away from this place, from the greasy shop floors where I'd balance books as a teenager while my brother Tom partied through his 20s, to the endless lectures from my father Robert about how my dreams of investigative reporting were nothing but a selfish escape from the real work of keeping the family legacy afloat after Mom's cancer claimed her when I was just 12, leaving me to navigate a household ruled by men's egos and unspoken resentments that painted me as the outlier, the daughter too independent for her own good, especially after my divorce from Mark 5 years ago turned me into the cautionary tale at every holiday gathering. Stepping into that fluorescent-lit community center room felt like plunging into a time capsule of discomfort, the air heavy with the mingled sense of instant coffee brewing in the corner and the faint mustiness of folding chairs that had seen too many town meetings, where Dad sat at the head of the table like the unchallenged patriarch he always imagined himself to be. His 68-year-old frame still broad from high school football days, but now softened by years of stress and solitary evenings, his arms crossed in that posture of authority that brooked no questions, while Tom lounged beside him at 45 with his tie already askew and a paunch straining against his shirt from too many post-shift beers at the local dive, exuding the confidence of the son who'd stayed to inherit the throne. And Cousin Lisa hovered quietly in the corner at her mid-40s, notepad in hand as the family's unofficial chronicler who observed more than she spoke, her sympathetic glances the only warmth in a room filled with aunts and uncles ready to whisper about my failed city life and how I'd abandoned them all for bylines in papers that barely paid the rent. Mr. Hargrove, the lawyer with his wire-rimmed glasses perpetually slipping down his nose and a voice raspy from decades of dry readings, began the proceedings with the methodical precision of someone who'd seen every family implode over assets, divvying up Grandpa's modest estate in clauses that echoed the straightforward man he'd been, the old Victorian house on Elm Street going to Dad for sentimental reasons tied to Mom's memory, the majority shares in Harper Motors allocated to Tom as the presumed steward of the business that had weathered recessions and plant closures, small cash bequests scattered to the cousins and aunts like crumbs to keep the peace, and when my name never surfaced amid the distributions. The room's atmosphere shifted from somber to smug, low chuckles building like thunder as Tom leaned toward me with that infuriating grin he'd perfected since we were kids fighting over the last slice of pie, whispering loud enough for all to hear. "Guess Grandpa finally came. 2. His senses about you, sis, all those years wasted typing up fluff pieces in Chicago instead of rolling up your sleeves here where it counts," and Dad nodded along with a rumble of agreement that masked his relief at seeing the prodigal daughter sidelined, while Aunt Karen chimed in from across the table about how I was always the dreamer who floated away like dandelion seeds, their collective laughter rippling through the space and landing like barbs on the raw spots I'd buried deep, reminding me of the weekends I'd spent in the shop's dim office reconciling invoices that Tom forgot while he networked at the VFW hall, or the way Dad had dismissed my college scholarship as a phase that would bring me crawling back, never acknowledging how my articles on corporate malfeasance in towns just like ours had exposed truths they preferred to ignore in their daily grind. The heat rose in my cheeks as I gripped the armrests of my chair, biting back the urge to unleash years of pent-up retorts. But I held steady, drawing on the reporter's instinct to observe and wait for the real story to unfold, because beneath their jabs I sensed the fragility of their triumph. The way Tom's eyes flicked nervously to Dad as if seeking approval for every dig, and Lisa's subtle frown suggesting she knew more than she let on about Grandpa's quiet favoritism toward me during those late-night phone calls where he'd ramble about the old days and hint at family secrets locked away like the battered trunk in his study that nobody else was allowed to touch. Yet I refused to let their mockery define the moment, straightening my posture and meeting Tom's gaze with a smile as sharp as the edge of a well-honed investigation, replying in a voice laced with the dry humor I'd honed covering political scandals. You know, Tom, it's amusing you talk about senses when yours have always been a bit off-kilter, dulled perhaps by all those extra hours you logged at the bar rather than the balance sheets. Remember that fiasco a few years back when you ordered the carburetor parts and we absorbed the hit while you sailed off on that fishing trip you called a business expense. Now that's what I call poetic justice coming full circle. And the room fell into an uneasy hush as Tom's face flushed crimson under the fluorescent glare, Dad shifting uncomfortably in his seat as if the chair had grown thorns. And even Aunt Karen's attempt at smoothing things over with chatter about the weather faltered into awkward silence, that small verbal parry serving as my first taste of reclaiming the narrative they'd scripted without me, a witty reminder that their image of a flawless family operation hid the same flaws I'd called out in my writing for years. Flaws that Grandpa must have seen too, given the way he'd confide in me about the business's soul being more than profit margins. The tension lingered like smoke after a fire as Mr. Hargrove cleared his throat once more, adjusting his glasses with a hesitation that piqued my curiosity, his gaze landing on a side table where a plain little envelope rested, its paper yellowed with age and sealed with what appeared to be Grandpa's old wax stamp from his Navy service days. My full name, Emily Harper, scrawled across the front in his familiar looping handwriting that trembled only slightly from the arthritis he'd battled in his final years. One additional item remains, he announced, his tone carrying an undercurrent of reluctance, as if he knew this would upend the fragile equilibrium we'd just endured. This was left separately for you alone, Mrs. Harper, with explicit instructions not to include it in the primary reading, and while I cannot speculate on its contents, your grandfather was quite insistent about its privacy. My pulse quickened at the sight of it, memories flooding back of those evenings in his workshop where he'd tinker with engine prototypes and drop vague allusions to protecting the true legacy from those who might squander it. His eyes often drifting to that locked trunk as if it held not just tools, but the weight of unspoken histories, and now with Tom leaning forward in disbelief, Dad's expression hardening into something akin to apprehension, and the entire room holding its collective breath, Mr. Hargrove carefully slit the seal with a letter opener, unfolding the single sheet inside to reveal words that would soon drain the color from faces and ignite a firestorm none of us could have anticipated, leaving me to wonder if this envelope contained the vindication I'd quietly craved or the unraveling of bonds I'd long since strained to breaking point. The envelope's contents seemed to pull the oxygen from the room as Mr. Hargrove's gravelly voice broke the heavy silence with Grandpa's handwritten words, each syllable landing like a carefully placed domino that would soon topple the assumptions my family had built their self-righteous narratives around for decades, starting with the declaration that named me, Emily Harper, the sole beneficiary and trustee of a hidden trust fund valued at $2 million, funds Grandpa had quietly siphoned away over the years into a diversified portfolio of blue-chip stocks in the auto industry and a discreet parcel of riverfront land on the outskirts of Milford that nobody in the family had ever mentioned because he'd purchased it under a shell company to shield it from the very mismanagement he'd foreseen in the business we'd all taken for granted as our birthright. Shock rippled outward from Dad's end of the table where his broad shoulders tensed and his coffee mug clattered against the saucer. As he processed the impossibility of it all, his face draining of color to leave a pallor that spoke volumes about the control he'd wielded since Mom's death turned him into the unchallenged head of the household, while Tom shot up from his chair with veins bulging in his neck, sputtering denials that echoed off the paneled walls of the community center like accusations flung in a courtroom drama I'd once covered involving embezzlement in a local union, insisting loudly that this had to be some kind of clerical error or forgery because Grandpa had verbally promised him that expansion fund during one of their late-night strategy sessions at the shop where Tom positioned himself as the visionary heir apparent, overlooking how those same sessions often devolved into complaints about my absence and the burden of carrying the family name without my so-called practical contributions. Cousin Lisa's eyes widened behind her notepad, her quiet demeanor cracking with a mix of surprise and what looked like quiet approval as she jotted notes furiously, perhaps sensing the shift in power dynamics that had always marginalized the women in our line. From Mom's overlooked suggestions during business meetings to my own pitches for ethical sourcing that Dad had dismissed as naive idealism unfit for the cutthroat world of parts distribution in a declining market. And even Aunt Karen paused mid-whisper to the uncle beside her, her gossiping halted by the sheer audacity of Grandpa's posthumous favoritism toward the daughter, who dared to leave the nest for a career that exposed the very corporate sins their operation skirted around with creative accounting. I sat there absorbing the revelation with a whirlwind of emotions churning inside me. Vindication mixing uneasily with the grief I'd barely begun to unpack since getting the call about Grandpa's heart giving out in his workshop, surrounded by the half-finished projects that symbolized his unyielding optimism for the American dream he'd chased. From his Navy discharge through the boom years of Detroit's influence on small towns like ours, but beneath the thrill of financial independence that could finally fund the investigative podcast I'd been pitching to Chicago outlets for months, there lurked a deeper unease about the implications of Grandpa's secrecy, because $2 million wasn't just money, it was a lifeline he'd preserved for me specifically. The one family member he'd trusted to use it wisely rather than let it vanish into the black hole of Tom's impulsive ventures, like that botched real estate deal 5 years back that nearly tanked the business before Dad bailed him out with inventory loans disguised as operational expenses. Mr. Hargrove continued reading with professional detachment, explaining how the trust was ironclad with no provisions for contestation due to its separate notarization dated 5 years prior, when Grandpa was still sharp enough to outmaneuver the estate lawyers Dad had hired to streamline the main will. And as he passed the document to me across the table, my fingers brushed the paper's worn edges, noticing for the first time a faint watermark on the envelope's flap, resembling the old Harper family crest from the business's founding era, a subtle emblem Grandpa had revived in his personal correspondence, as if marking territory against the dilutions Tom and Dad had introduced through their shortcuts and favoritism toward loyal, but inefficient suppliers who kicked back under the table perks at industry trade shows in Vegas that Tom bragged about during family barbecues. Dad recovered his composure enough to launch into a tirade that filled the room with the bluster of a man cornered by his own history, banging his fist on the table and declaring that this betrayal couldn't stand because I'd abandoned the family when they needed me most. Right after Mom's funeral, when the shop was hemorrhaging jobs from the latest recession and Tom's drinking had escalated to the point of missed deliveries, conveniently forgetting how I'd wired money home anonymously during my early reporting gigs in Detroit, and how Grandpa had thanked me in those private letters for keeping the faith and integrity over expediency, his words now echoing in this very document as a rebuke to the path they'd chosen. Tom piled on with accusations of manipulation, demanding to see the investment breakdowns and insisting that the river land must be a clerical mix-up since Grandpa had ranted about selling it off to cover debts during one of his lucid spells. But I held the paper close to my chest, deciding in that charged moment to withhold the specifics I'd already gleaned from a quick scan, the stocks heavy in electric vehicle tech that aligned with my pieces on the future of manufacturing. The land primed for eco-friendly development that could revitalize Milford without the strip malls Tom favored, and instead offered a casual shrug laced with the wry humor that had gotten me through tougher interrogations in newsrooms, replying to their barrage, "Well, boys, looks like you'll have to content yourselves with the executor's full report in a few weeks, much like how you always wait for the post-game specials at the bar before tallying up the real costs." watching with quiet satisfaction as Tom's jaw clenched and Dad's glare faltered into frustrated impotence. That deliberate omission acting as a clever retaliation that let them simmer in uncertainty, while I savored the reversal of fortunes they'd never seen coming, a petty but pointed way to mirror the years they'd dangled information and opportunities just out of my reach during visits home. The reading dissolved into a cacophony of forced small talk and sideways glances as people shuffled toward the exit, the aunts murmuring about how this would change everything, in hushed tones that carried the undercurrent of resentment toward the woman who'd unexpectedly risen from the footnotes of family lore. But Dad lingered by the door to pull me aside with a grip on my arm that was firm yet laced with desperation, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper as he warned that money couldn't buy back loyalty or erase the years I'd spent building a life separate from the one he'd mapped out for all of us, his eyes searching mine for the compliance that had defined our interactions since childhood. Yet I nodded politely while inwardly mapping my escape route to Grandpa's house on Elm Street, where the real answers likely waited, amid his cluttered study and that enigmatic trunk. Tom followed us out to the parking lot, his phone already buzzing with calls to whatever shady advisor he'd cultivated in the business's underbelly, muttering threats about legal challenges that rang hollow against the document's safeguards. But as I slid into my car and the engine turned over with a familiar rumble that evoked memories of Grandpa teaching me to drive on these very back roads, the envelope tucked securely in my glove compartment felt like a talisman against the storm brewing behind me, and though doubt flickered about whether this windfall would heal old wounds or widen them into chasms, one line from Grandpa's note that Mr. Hargrove hadn't voiced aloud burned in my mind. They've hidden more than finances. Check the trunk for the proof that explains it all. Propelling me toward the Victorian shadowed driveway where the house stood sentinel under gathering clouds, its windows dark and promising revelations that could either empower my fresh start or entangle me irrevocably in the family's tangled web of deceptions. Grandpa's house on Elm Street welcomed me back with the familiar creak of the front door that always seemed to protest against intruders, even when it was just family rummaging through the remnants of a life built on grit and guarded secrets. And as I navigated the dim hallway toward his study, where the air hung thick with the lingering aroma of pipe tobacco and machine oil that had seeped into the walls over decades of late-night tinkering, my footsteps echoed softly on the worn oak floors that Grandpa had refinished himself after a flood in the 70s nearly wiped out the business's early records, pulling me deeper into the labyrinth of memories I'd both cherished and fled from during my years in Chicago, where stories of corporate intrigue paid the bills, but never quite filled the void left by the family dynamics that had pushed me away in the first place. The trunk waited in the corner of the study like a silent sentinel from Grandpa's Navy days, its leather straps cracked from age and travel, but the lock still sturdy under my fingers as I dialed in the combination using our birth years, Tom's followed by mine. A gesture Grandpa had once explained as a way to bind the grandkids in shared history, even as the family fractures widened under Dad's iron-fisted rule after Mom's passing turned the household into a shrine to productivity over emotion. And with a satisfying click, the lid lifted to reveal a treasure trove of yellowed ledgers, faded correspondence, and bundled receipts that spoke to the meticulous accountant Grandpa had been beneath his grease-stained exterior. Documents that chronicled not just the rise of Harper Motors from a one-bay garage to a regional supplier, but also the slow erosion of trust as entries from the last 15 years showed discrepancies mounting like unpaid debts. Profits siphoned into off-books accounts that funded Tom's extravagant side pursuits, such as that ill-fated condo development in Cleveland which collapsed under regulatory scrutiny, while the shop's employees faced layoffs blamed on overseas competition rather than internal mismanagement. Diving into the folder marked Harper Motors Truth that sat atop the pile like an accusation waiting to be voiced, I pieced together the extent of the betrayal with a growing knot in my stomach that twisted tighter with each forged invoice revealing how Dad and Tom had inflated supplier costs to pocket the difference, diverting tens of thousands over the years into personal ventures that ranged from Tom's luxury truck collection parked ostentatiously in the shop lot to Dad's quiet investments in a rival dealership that undercut their own prices during lean times. all while lecturing me during holiday visits about the virtues of loyalty and hard work in the face of economic headwinds that my reporting often highlighted as symptoms of broader greed in the manufacturing sector. The twist that hit hardest came from a stack of notarized statements dated after Grandpa's mild stroke 3 years prior, signatures mimicking his looping script, but executed in Tom's steadier hand according to the subtle differences Grandpa had taught me to spot during our workshop sessions where he'd warn about the wolves in sheep's clothing within even the tightest family circles, implying that they'd impersonated him to approve loans against the business's assets. A deception that could unravel not just their reputations, but the entire operation in a town where word of financial improprieties spread faster than flu season and jeopardized the jobs of the loyal mechanics who'd stuck by through multiple recessions. The dilemma gnawed at me as I sat cross-legged on the study rug amid the scattered papers, weighing the satisfaction of exposing this rot to the authorities or the small claims court that handled such local scandals against the fallout that would inevitably drag Mom's name through the mud, since Dad had leveraged her inheritance to secure those very loans, forcing me to confront whether my thirst for justice mirrored the independence they'd mocked or veered into the vindictive territory that would make me no better than the opportunists who'd driven me from Milford, especially when I considered how viewers in similar Midwestern families might judge my hesitation as weakness or my action as cruelty in the delicate balance of blood ties strained by ambition. Determined to test the waters without fully committing to the plunge, I confronted Tom the following morning at the shop, where the clang of wrenches and hum of air compressors provided a gritty soundtrack to our inevitable clash. Marching through the bays with the incriminating folder tucked under my arm like evidence in one of my old exposés on union busting in steel towns, finding him elbow-deep in a transmission rebuild that he abandoned with a greasy rag toss upon seeing my determined stride. His initial smirk faded into defensiveness as I spread the documents across his workbench, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the forged pages that laid bare their scheme in stark numbers and dates, prompting him to lean in with feigned confusion before launching into a barrage of excuses about how those adjustments were merely creative accounting to survive the auto industry's shift toward imports, and how Dad had approved every move as the rightful steward after Grandpa's health declined, conveniently omitting the stroke timeline that proved otherwise and the way those funds had padded his lifestyle, while the shop's pension contributions lagged behind industry standards. Dad arrived midway through the heated exchange, summoned by Tom's frantic text, his presence filling the bay with the authoritative bulk that had intimidated suppliers and siblings alike. Barking at Tom to hold his tongue while directing glares my way that accused me of betrayal for unearthing what they'd buried under layers of family obligation, but as the argument escalated into a standoff amid the scent of hydraulic fluid and tension, Lisa's call interrupted with her soft voice offering concern after spotting my car at the house the night before, pulling me aside for a hushed conversation where she confessed to having overheard fragments of similar suspicions from Grandpa during her visits when she'd help with his meals, her role as the quiet supporter emerging as a potential ally in navigating this minefield without losing myself entirely to the revenge cycle. That evening, over platters of diner comfort food, juicy burgers and crispy fries that evoked the simpler gatherings before ambition soured everything, we met in a back booth away from prying eyes, where I shared the outlines of the skimming without delving into the forgery's depth, and Lisa responded by sliding an antique photo across the Formica table, its sepia tones capturing Grandpa in his prime, shaking hands with a younger man who bore no resemblance to Dad despite the official stories of seamless succession. The inscription on the back in Grandpa's hand reading "The True Partner, 1962, before the shadows crept in," a clue that hinted at deceptions far beyond financial fiddling. Perhaps adoption or outright fabrication of lineage to secure control in an era when family name meant everything in business circles. Emboldened by the partial alliance, but fueled by the day's revelations, I exacted a measured revenge that night by firing off an anonymous tip to the regional business rag about questionable inventory practices at Harper Motors that alluded to overordering without naming culprits, watching from my phone as the blurb appeared online within hours and Tom's social media erupted with defensive posts from his network. The dent his ego manifesting in frantic voicemails demanding explanations that I ignored while savoring the clever sting of turning their secrecy against them in a way that echoed my journalistic roots. Yet as the photo burned a hole in my pocket and the trunk's deeper layers beckoned from the house, uncertainty loomed larger than the satisfaction, because what deeper betrayal did this image unveil? And would Lisa's next revelation propel me toward exposure, or pull me back from the brink just as the family's fragile facade began to crack under the weight of truths long overdue? The antique photo Lisa had slipped me at the diner haunted my thoughts through a night of fitful sleep in Grandpa's guest room where the quilt smelled faintly of mothballs, and the wind rattled the panes like impatient ghosts demanding entry, compelling me to return to the study at first light with a thermos of strong coffee to cross-reference the image's details against the trunk's archival bounty under the slanting rays that filtered through half-drawn blinds and illuminated dust motes dancing like unspoken accusations in the air still heavy from yesterday's discoveries. Scrutinizing the sepia print revealed anomalies that unraveled the family's polished origin story with surgical precision, the younger man beside Grandpa bearing features that echoed none of our shared traits, no Dad's square jaw or Tom's lanky build, but rather a softer profile that matched faded newspaper clippings about a 1962 partnership dissolution after a fatal accident involving faulty brakes from a competitor's line, suggesting Grandpa had brought Dad into the fold not as blood kin, but as an adopted figurehead to stabilize the business amid grief and legal threats. A move that explained the subtle tensions in old family albums where Mom's wedding photos showed Dad as an outsider grafted onto the Harper lineage through marriage and convenience rather than heritage. Her quiet strength the glue that had held the facade together until illness stripped it away and left Dad to rule with the resentment of a man forever proving his place. This revelation deepened the moral quagmire I'd waded into since the will reading, pitting my drive for transparency, honed by years of uncovering scandals in boardrooms from Detroit to Chicago, against the ethical cost of dismantling the mythos that had sustained aunts, uncles, and even Lisa through holidays and hardships, forcing me to grapple with whether voicing this would honor Grandpa's intent to protect the real legacy, or inflict wounds that echoed the losses I'd reported on in families shattered by revelations of infidelity and forgery in the heartland's conservative enclaves, where bloodlines defined worth more than actions ever could. Armed with this contextual bomb and the ledgers that corroborated the financial rot as a symptom of Dad's insecure grasp on power, I orchestrated the confrontation that afternoon in the family kitchen at the house on Oak Lane, where Mom had once presided over meals that masked the undercurrents of discord. The space now cluttered with casserole dishes from sympathetic neighbors who buzzed about the trust fund gossip spreading through Milford's coffee clutches like wildfire after my anonymous tip had forced Tom into damage control mode with frantic supplier calls that echoed from his office down the hall. Dad was there alone, hunched over a mug of black coffee at the scarred pine table that bore the marks of countless family councils, his eyes shadowed from a night of stewing over the shop's precarious books and the whispers reaching him about potential audits, looking every bit the weary patriarch whose bluster had cracked under the weight of truths he'd long suppressed. And as I entered with the photo and documents in hand, the scent of Aunt Karen's pot roast lingering from her obligatory drop-off that morning, I laid them out methodically like exhibits in a deposition I'd once prepared for a source facing embezzlement charges. His initial denial erupted in a gravelly protest about dredging up ancient history to justify my outsider claims on the estate, insisting the adoption, if it even qualified as such, had been a merciful act after the accident orphaned the business's future, and that Mom's love had forged unbreakable bonds beyond paperwork. But as I pointed to the discrepancies in timelines and the forged signatures post-stroke that tied his maneuvers to self-preservation rather than stewardship, his defenses crumbled into admissions laced with justification, confessing the skimming as necessary buffers against market crashes that my city reporting had sensationalized without understanding the human toll on operators like him who juggled payrolls and pride in a dying industry. The exchange drew Lisa into the fray when she arrived uninvited with fresh-baked pies as a pretext for checking in, her presence shifting the dynamic as she corroborated snippets from Grandpa's bedside confessions about ungrateful interlopers who'd twisted his vision for the company into a vehicle for personal gain, her alliance bolstering my resolve even as Dad's pleas invoked Mom's memory to guilt me into silence, painting my independence as the root of the family's unraveling since I'd left for college and never fully returned, a narrative that stung with partial truth given how my absences had widened the emotional chasms, but also freed me from the toxicity that now threatened to consume us all. By evening, the so-called reconciliation dinner convened at the local diner under the guise of airing grievances over heaping plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes that provided a nostalgic veneer to the simmering hostilities. The booth crammed with Dad's brooding silence, Tom's sullen arrivals after a day of fielding investor jitters from my tips ripples, Aunt's chattering obliviously about town news, and Lisa's watchful eyes as the sole buffer against outright war, where casual queries about the trust's implications opened the door for my calculated exposé woven into the conversation with the precision of a feature story I'd craft for a weekend edition. When Aunt Karen innocently prodded about Grandpa's surprise for me, I steered the dialogue with wry anecdotes that exposed the mismanagement without unleashing the adoption thunderbolt, recounting with feigned nostalgia how Tom's creative inventory had once vanished into a weekend getaway disguised as a trade conference while the shop's holiday fund for employees evaporated, prompting chuckles from the cousins at Tom's reddening discomfort and even a reluctant snort from Dad that acknowledged the folly, transforming the meal into a tableau of reversed fortunes where my words served as the witty scalpel, dissecting their hypocrisies in front of witnesses, a revenge that satisfied the itch for payback by eroding their authority through humor rather than outright assault, leaving Tom fuming into his napkin and Dad uncharacteristically quiet as plates cleared amid an undercurrent of reevaluated respect. Yet the evening's fragile détente shattered when my phone buzzed with a call from Mr. Hargrove just as we lingered over coffee refills, his measured tone conveying urgency about an additional sealed letter from the estate that had surfaced in a safety deposit box overlooked during initial inventories. One Grandpa had earmarked for me with instructions to deliver only after the initial shock settled, promising within its folds the full truth they buried deeper than finances or facades. A phrase that sent a chill racing down my spine as I pocketed the device and met Lisa's questioning gaze across the table, the weight of impending disclosure hanging over the group like a storm front rolling in from Lake Erie, making me wonder if this final missive would arm me with the clarity to forgive and rebuild or unleash a cataclysm that severed ties irreparably, especially with the attic's unexplored corners whispering of more clues Lisa hinted at during her drive over, pulling the narrative toward a confrontation that could redefine not just the inheritance, but the very essence of who we Harpers, or whatever we truly were claimed to be. The lawyer's office on Main Street felt oppressively confined that final morning, as if the walls themselves conspired to compress the air around the polished oak desk, where Mr. Hargrove placed the newly unearthed letter with the reverence due a Pandora's box disguised as legal correspondence, its envelope bearing Grandpa's unmistakable seal, and my name inked with the deliberation of a man tying up life's loose ends after witnessing too many betrayals erode the foundations he'd laid for generations, compelling me to unfold it in the privacy of a side chair while Dad and Tom paced the outer lobby like caged animals awaiting a verdict that could strip them of the illusions they'd cultivated since the business's turbulent inception in the post-war boom when Grandpa had clawed opportunity from the jaws of loss following the accident that claimed his first wife and nearly the company along with her. The words within leaped off the page in Grandpa's no-nonsense prose that blended affection with indictment, detailing how Dad had entered the family not through blood but adoption orchestrated in the shadows of 1962 to fill a void after the partnership fallout and provide a stable face for investors wary of a grieving widower. A pragmatic choice that soured when Dad married Mom to cement his stake and then proceeded to steer Harper Motors toward shortcuts that prioritized personal security over the ethical core Grandpa had instilled, including the skimming schemes that funneled resources into Tom's follies and Dad's hidden stakes and competitors, all while Grandpa amassed the trust as a safeguard for the one grandchild, me, who'd inherited his skepticism toward unchecked ambition. The riverfront land serving as the ultimate repository of proof with buried deeds that confirmed his sole ownership and potential for redemption through community-focused development like worker co-ops that aligned with the progressive angles in my Chicago dispatches on revitalizing Rust Belt economies. This bombshell crystallized the impossible essence of Dad's outburst at the while reading. His shout not mere denial, but terror at the exposure of a fabricated legacy that had propped up their authority through decades of family lore spun at Thanksgiving tables and VFW toasts, twisting my initial triumph into a labyrinth of empathy and outrage as I grappled with the human cost of their deceptions, the jobs lost to cover-ups, Mom's unwitting role in the charade, and the way Grandpa's silence had preserved a fragile peace at the expense of truth that now demanded reckoning in a town where such scandals could exile reputations faster than foreclosures during the last downturn. Emerging from the office into the parking lot where gravel crunched underfoot like brittle bones of old secrets, I confronted them head-on with the letter clutched in my fist like a declaration of independence drafted in the heat of familial civil war. The autumn gusts whipping leaves into eddies that mirrored the chaos unfolding as Dad's face blanched anew to the shade of weathered siding on abandoned factories, his truck's door handle gripped white-knuckled while Tom lunged forward with demands to see the paper. His voice cracking between fury and fear that this would torpedo the supplier deals he'd been scrambling to salvage after my tip's fallout rippled through the network of auto wholesalers who'd long suspected but never proven the irregularities. Lisa arrived in her sensible sedan just in time to join the fray, clutching a sheaf of attic documents she'd unearthed overnight, original adoption papers yellowed with time and notarized in a neighboring county to evade local gossip, alongside ledgers predating Dad's involvement that painted Grandpa's true partner as a betrayed ally whose heirs could still claim restitution if the full story surfaced in court filings or my journalistic circles. Her intervention tipping the scales as she read aloud the confirmatory clauses in a steady voice that cut through Tom's bluster about fabricated evidence and Dad's pleas invoking Mom's sanctity to shield the narrative they'd built around her as the heart of the Harper dynasty. The conflict crested in a whirlwind of accusations and admissions. Tom snatching futilely at the papers while Dad slumped against his vehicle murmuring fragmented apologies about loving Mom despite the opportunistic start and regretting the drifts from Grandpa's path that turned necessity into greed. His vulnerability piercing my resolve and planting seeds of doubt about whether my pursuit mirrored the very opportunism I decried in exposés on family businesses crumbling under ethical lapses, especially as Lisa's eyes pleaded for mercy on behalf of the cousins and employees caught in the crossfire, making me question if empowerment required total demolition or a more nuanced reclamation that preserved some semblance of the bonds that had shaped me amid the shop's clamor and Mom's quiet wisdom. In the heat of that parking lot maelstrom, my culminating revenge manifested not through explosive leaks to the press or lawsuits that would dominate Milford's headlines for months, but in a strategic proposition delivered with the calculated poise of a negotiator closing a high-stakes source deal, offering to deploy the trust's resources to inject capital into Harper Motors under my direct trusteeship as the condition for averting full disclosure, a clever maneuver that stripped them of unchecked reins while salvaging the payrolls and supplier contracts teetering on the brink, forcing Tom to swallow his pride in the face of bankruptcy threats and Dad to concede with a nod that acknowledged the reversal of roles he'd never anticipated from the daughter he'd dismissed as flighty. The uneasy pact held as we caravaned to the river plot that afternoon, the winding drive along the Ohio's banks evoking Grandpa's tales of fishing trips where he'd impart lessons on stewardship amid the current's relentless flow, leading us to the overgrown thicket where a rusted metal box lay interred beneath a marker disguised as a survey stone, its contents spilling forth with the pristine deeds and stock certificates that affirmed the land's value not just monetarily, but as a canvas for renewal. Perhaps affordable housing for displaced workers or a green tech hub that echoed my visions for sustainable manufacturing under the dipping sun that cast long shadows symbolizing the elongated uncertainties ahead. Yet ambiguity shrouded the horizon like the gathering dusk, Dad's halting confession of genuine affection for Mom amid the scheme's origins stirring a flicker of possible reconciliation that clashed with the sword Grandpa urged me to wield, leaving me at the water's edge to ponder whether to amplify the adoption saga through anonymous channels for cathartic justice or seal it away for a tentative family reboot on my terms, the choice echoing unanswered in the rustle of reeds and the distant hum of the town that had birthed us all, inviting reflection on whether true legacy lay in vengeance's sharp edge or forgiveness's uncertain path, and what path you might forge in the tangle of love, loss, and long-buried truths that define so many American kinships.